Now, this evening, we pivot from Europe under Nazi occupation and the Atlantic Wall and the preparations to the Allied air campaign that set the conditions for Operation Overlord to begin the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe and set the conditions for countries to live in freedom in a free world. As such, we're honored tonight to feature Dr. Don Mueller, one of the outstanding historians of World War II, a long-serving friend of the National WWII Museum, and of course, author of the best-selling Masters of the Air. And for the Apple TV miniseries, as you know, he served as the chief consultant. Now tonight, Don's joined on stage for a conversation with Dr. Nick Mueller, our own president and CEO emeritus, and the co-founder with Stephen Ambrose of the National WWII, or the National D-Day Museum, that of course became that. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Nick and Don to continue mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Am I all keyed up? Everybody can hear? Just to start on a personal note, we began in Hamburg, Germany. Let's tell you about how old I am. I was a boy of 14, 1953, wandering through the ruins of that city. It didn't look much different than it did in 1945. My grandmother, who died in the 30s, lived there, so I had relatives there and went to school for a few months in a little village outside of Hamburg. But it was a pretty graphic evidence of the violence that you heard talked about, and it was violence from the air. And Don Mueller is here to talk to you about that, but has an important personal memory for me. And Don knows more about air war than probably any living historian, and probably more than any past historian, with his great book on the Masters of the Air. So I'm just going to start off. Now I've got 4 or 5 areas to talk to Don about, but Don's going to go his own way. So don't be surprised if I only get to 1 or 2 of the questions that I'm going to ask of Don. But I thought we'd start at where those bombers flew at about 30,000 feet, Don. And why don't you just give us a context of the war, the strategic goals that the war started from the air and ended from the air. And there's an assumption that both the Axis and the Allied powers felt that the war was the key to victory was air power. And so you might comment whether you think that's true or not. And then secondly, what are the goals and the strategies of the air war, especially in the focusing more on the last years of the war, which I know you'd like to talk about. So.
Okay, how much time do we have? 2 hours there?
Yeah, see, there we go.
For me, the war begins in Guernica, in the Basque Country in Spain, with a heavy Luftwaffe raid of that little village in Picasso's memorialization of it. And that's fantastic painting. And it brought home to the world the horror and terror of a new form of weapon. We had never flew this high. We had never fought this high. This is a brand new war. It's in the history of warfare. And even infantry in the 1920s drew on infantry examples going back to Caesar and up through Napoleon. But the air war is entirely experimental. And so it's a surprise to the men who flew. It's a surprise to the men who prepared the war. And it's kind of a miracle that we were able to pull it off in such a short period of time. I never argued that air power won World War II, but certainly we could have not have won World War II without air power. Both tactical power, that is 2-engine bombers supporting troops on the ground, along with fast-flying fighters like Thunderbolts and Mustangs and Lightnings, and 4 big 4-engine bombers like the B-17 and the B-24 Liberator, and with the British, the Sterling, and the gigantic Lancaster. We're the only 2 countries in World War II, the UK and the United States, that has 4-engine bombers, and prepared before the war for an air war. The United States beginning in about 1935, the British about the same time, when Bomber Command, a department of the Royal Air Force is formed with the purpose of exterminating German cities if they could, and destroying the population base, destroying morale. And about the same time, the United States evolves a very different strategy. The British are going to fly by day, but later by night, when that doesn't work out. The Americans from the beginning committed to flying by day. They had the hubris to believe that their new B-17 bomber, which is just fully developed around 1936. So by 36, we had the instrument to do this, to deliver, the hurt. And we also had a brand new super sophisticated technology called the Norden bomb sight. And a lot of hope was invested in this instrument. And supposedly from 23,000 feet, with a good navigator, you could drop bombs to an area about as big as the area in front of this stage. The phrase at the time was pickle barrel bombing, that you could actually drop bombs into a pickle barrel. Well, as we're going to see, pinpoint bombing became an oxymoron. No such thing in World War II. And, of course, the British wind up getting hammered. They're flying before the United States is even in the war. The bomber war begins almost immediately when a stray German bomber flies over London and accidentally drops bombs inside London. And Hitler reciprocates with the terror rate, and Churchill reciprocates, and this is how it went for the rest of the war. And of course, after Dunkirk, when Britain doesn't have a land army for quite a time on the continent, Churchill depends very heavily on air power to the very end with cities like Leipzig and Dresden. Although he kind of runs away from this, if you read his multi-volume history of World War II, there's very little mention of the bombers. Lots of mention of the fighters. They are the heroes in Britain. When I used to visit a little bar in London across from the RAF chapel, and where the RAF veterans would meet, and I'd do interviews there, I'd meet with the bomber crews, and they were pissed, really pissed. And the reason was that it wasn't that credit went out to the boys who flew the Hurricanes and the Spitfires and saved the empire, but there was no credit given, not even a campaign medal, if you could believe it, to Bomber Command. And they took staggering losses. Your chances of not dying if you flew with Bomber Command were 80%. And in the very beginning of the war, by the end of the war, your chances of dying were 80%. So,
well, Don, let's go back to. Should I stop you for a second? We go back to your point about starting with Guernica with Hitler and following citizens as, and then you talked about destroying cities and breaking the will from the Allied goals. Where do we cross that moral line ourselves? And it started with Hitler, but
well, they never really see it, Nick. So morality plays very little in it. We did cross a moral divide during the war. I think the British crossed it when having initial. There is a supreme kind of irony here in that both Roosevelt, actually three, Roosevelt, Chamberlain, and Hitler all issued pronunciamentos in 1938 condemning the aerial bombing of cities. That's 1 year before this mess starts. And the British aren't interested in hitting cities at first. They didn't have the equipment to do it. And the Germans had pretty strong defenses by that time because they expected when Britain hit them, and they hit them hard with the voyage bombers they were developing. But the bombing wasn't effective, and they were taking staggering losses. So they went to night bombing, and you can't see the target. And if you can't see the target, the bombing is going to be radically, wildly indiscriminate. And you're going to hit churches and schools and hospitals along with the targets. And the bombing is not just inaccurate, it's abysmally accurate. In one study they did, out of 100 bombs they dropped, 2 of them got within 10 miles of the target. That's how badly and ineffective the bombing was. Now, over time, Britain continued stubbornly. They thought we were crazy to fly by air, by daylight, by the way, because the Germans had the best fighter force in the world, and their day fighters were much more numerous and effective than their night fighters. They had to develop a whole night flying force to combat the British night attacks. But when the bombing starts to evolve, if you can't hit anything, the idea becomes to burn everything. And they found this out when they were hit by the Germans during what we know as the Blitz, when 40,000 people in London alone were killed. And they examined the German bombing, and they found that it was much more effective when the Germans used incendiaries, stick bombs about that long, filled with explosives, not napalm yet. The Americans developed napalm in 1942. DuPont Chemical developed napalm. And most of our firebombs later were napalm. These stick bombs would hit, they'd burst, they'd spread their inflammatory materials around. Sometimes if you use phosphorus, it stuck to the skin, could get it off. The idea here, once this maniac, I thought, Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, he was called Butch by his airmen who loved him because he defended them so strongly. Harris said, look, as I see it, everyone in Germany is a target. That includes a woman who works in a munitions factory loading powder into bombs. She's as much of a target as a submarine captain. She's as much of a target as a Wehrmacht captain on the front. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to bomb. He says, I don't want to bomb factories. I don't want to kill factories. I want to kill people. And I want to kill workers, productive workers. Because a productive worker is much more expensive, difficult, and valuable to the cause, hard to train, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what he's done, and that's crossing a serious moral line in violation of. There weren't heavy Geneva Conventions at the time, but there were strictures coming out of The Hague and things like that, following Guernica, about the bombing, the deliberate bombing of cities. Where you say, as I talked to a German woman, I said, the Americans missed a lot, so they killed a lot of people. But British, it was hard to miss because you saturated the city. Area bombing was, and the British, that's kind of the euphemism. It is extermination bombing. Harris was always very blunt in what he called it. He called it terror bombing. And he was proud to burn and annihilate cities. And he annihilated 32 of them. Scorched them. Hamburg, 44,000 casualties. Dresden, 24 to 26,000 casualties, etc. Würzburg, cathedral and university town, wiped off the face of the earth. There was not a single person left in Würzburg after the bombing. So, that's, and there was very little questioning of this in the press or otherwise, because England feels that it's justified. It's been hit by the Germans. It's lost, tens of thousands of people, in German raids, men, women, and children. There's general panic in the country. The German invasion of England didn't take place. But that's not how you see history. Most of the history I read is bullshit. It really doesn't make a lot of sense because it's history by hindsight. I have a theory called the fallacy of hindsight. If you start at the end of the war and you know who won it, it's going to be easy to tell it. Because then this is how I was taught it in high school and college. Although I wasn't a history major in college, I didn't take my first history course until I was going for a PhD. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate. But the way it was taught was if you knew the South, for example, the American Civil War lost the war, you could easily identify as a student what the causes of the loss were because you're looking backward. But what you miss in that is the drama of life as it's lived. And isn't that what history's supposed to do? Put us on the spot, put us in the persons who are enacting the action, put us behind the eyes of these people before they make the decision to drop the bombs, when it's a live option, whether it's a drop or not, whether there's a debate on it, when nobody knows what's going to happen, just as nobody knows in this room is they're going to survive this lecture, even Clark out of the room. I mean, you have no idea what's going to happen to your life in the next 5 minutes. And that's how wars are fought. And
well, let's come back to right there.
Yeah.
Put us behind the eyes of those guys that are in the plane and what it was like campaigning in that air war in that plane right there.
Yeah, that's it. Now, you got to remember that, let's go to the 8th Air Force, for example, continues to fly. We briefly experimented. We were so inaccurate in our early bombing that Churchill wanted to fold the 8th Air Force into Bomber Command at the Casablanca Conference. And Ira Eger, who was head of the 8th Air Force Bomber Command, resisted that. And Eger convinced Churchill with this melodious phrase, round-the-clock bombing, daylight bombing by the Americans, followed by nighttime bombing of the Germans, 24 hours of hell. And Churchill loved that idea. Kill the Boche, kill them all. And so that's where we went to that. But that never really became a reality because the British and Americans coordinate their raids. But anyway, we're flying separately. But this is how an 8th Air Force flyer would experience it. And I think the biggest surprise for me in my research, my dad was in the Air Force in World War II, and I should have known more about this. But the supreme surprise, and the one I think we make most effectively in the movie Masters of the Air, which, unlike the Tom Hanks movies earlier here, are entirely in the air, and unlike the Tom Cruise air movies, are filmed from outside the plane, so you get a dogfight action. We did that movie. That's why Nick's question is so germane, from inside the cockpit, because that's where the drama was. That's where the action was. That's where the killing took place. That's where guys broke down or stuck together. So you got to remember that over 50% of these kids, average age of a bomber crew member was 19 to 24. The old man in the plane was the pilot, 24 to 25 years old. And you're flying above 11,000 feet, which, as mountain climbers know, is when you put on the oxygen. So you're tethered to the plane. You have an electrical suit on, which to warm you, but a lot of times, like those little Christmas trees, when one light went out, the whole damn thing went out. Christmas Eve was always the worst day of the year for me when I had to put together the kids' toys like that. My daughter screamed from upstairs, "Why is Dad swearing so much?" I said, putting together the toys. But anyway, you're tethered to the plane, and you can see, if it's a cloudy day, even with a Norden bomb sight, you can't see the target. A Norden bomb sight can't penetrate cloud cover. So they invented a system called H2X, which sent a radio beam to the ground and bounced it back. And all that could give you was, there's water, there's land. That's it. That's how much you knew about the target. So you don't see it at all. Now, as you're coming in, you're flying at about 24,000 feet on a raid. If it's Berlin, and it's January in Berlin, inside the plane, it's about 52 degrees below zero. Okay. There's no heat in the plane at all. You have heavy outfits on and things like that. That doesn't do much good. So no oxygen, no sunlight, no heat. And you don't know where the enemy is. And they come on you with terrifying suddenness. Some of the scenes you might have seen in Masters of the Air we try to depict that. Just, wow. And all of a sudden, there's 50 fighter planes, like little bugs out there. And if that bug was on the wall back there, that bug is a fighter plane, a Focke-Wulf, for example. And 1, 2, 3, and he's past you. That's how much chance you had to hit him. So the gunners open up, and they're hosing the air with bullets. And you've got a formation that's really tight, so tight. Paul Tibbets dropped the atomic bomb, but is best known early in the war as the best fighter pilot, the best bomber pilot in the 8th Air Force. Tibbets told me that when he was flying, he said, it's really hard to hold the yoke of the plane and steer it. He said, sometimes my wing would bump into the wing of the plane next to me. The idea that this combat box of 24 planes, each of them with 10 powerful 50 caliber machine guns, will be impervious to German attacks. So again, the hubris is built into this. This is paper warfare before it's ever been tested. This is tested in Alabama at the Air Force Tac School. And they thought, with this kind of defensive system flying, probably they believed early on that the B-17 had a higher ceiling, could get higher than the fighters, and were as fast as the fighters. And they told these kids that not to worry about flak. Don't even worry about it. Fly above the flak, fly over the flak. But when you went into combat, to reach the target, you had to fly through a flak field that's about 10 miles wide by 5 miles square. And if a flak shell, live shell, hits the plane, it's the end. The plane explodes. Don't forget, the plane carries all its gas in its wings. So you're flying a gas tank into Germany, filled with bombs. Okay. That's an interesting way to go into combat. I mean, the closest equivalent to that would be a Marine on Peleliu with a flamethrower on his back. And their life expectancy was something like 6 minutes. Well, the Air Force life expectancy flying these missions is 11 missions. You got to the 11th of the 25 you were supposed to fly. It was later extended to 25, 30, 35 was the limit. Your life expectancy is really grim. About 1 in 4 chance, sometimes 1 in 3 chance of surviving a mission. Harrison Salisbury, the New York Times, said to fly with the 8th Air Force is to hold a ticket to a funeral of your own. And so these are suicide missions. And
So what were they, let's stop right there for a second. What were they thinking now? So what did they feel as they progressed through their missions? And
well,
it took to fly into that flak.
it's crazy to believe they weren't scared because they were all scared. And to believe, to be what the Air Force guys used to kid around and call them war lovers, to believe that you weren't going to be hurt, to believe that you could survive the mission, to believe that you could best the wolf off of the fight was a chimera. It just didn't seem like it was possible. So there's this tremendous sense of despondency on the part of the crews as they go along on their missions. I did a lot of my interviewing with Andy Rooney, crusty Andy Rooney, you know. He didn't have a secretary, he just picked the phone up, Rooney. So, all right. And he flew with the 8th Air Force, and he flew missions and on flight medal. He went through flight training, and not how to fly a plane, but he learned to be a gunner on a plane. And he's the only war reporter to win an infantry medal and an air medal. But Rooney said, I wanted to visit a college buddy of mine at another base. Rooney was in London covering the war for the GI newspaper, Stars and Stripes. So he said, I went up to the air base, and I expected it to be like a college campus. 3,000 young men, a couple Red Cross girls, a little shortage there. God help those Red Cross girls. 3,000 guys and 6 of them. But anyway, so off to town you went. He goes on base, and he's asked where the Nissan hut of his buddy is that he's directed there, and he passes a volleyball game. And he's transfixed all of a sudden. And he sat there for 15 minutes. He said they played volleyball for 6-7 minutes, and no one uttered a sound, not even a grunt. He said, somebody who was sitting next to him, he said, what's going on? He said, they just lost. They have a softball team. He said, they just lost their second baseman, first baseman, right fielder, pitcher, and catcher yesterday. And it's a bad day on base. And he said that's the way the missions were. So the whole time, Tom Hanks and I would talk about this all the time. What's the theme of the movie? Well, it's the theme of the 8th Air Force. How in the hell did they get back in the plane?
That's right.
After seeing death so close. We all have this image of my uncle served with the big red one on D-Day, first in. D-Day, first 10 minutes. And he saw heavy action right through the war with the 1st Division. But he's talked with my father, and they agreed that my father, flying as a gunner, was closer to the enemy than he ever was in the whole war. And he was in North Africa, the Hürtgen Forest, and Germany when they crossed the Rhine. I talked to Norman Hatch, who filmed the Battle of Tarawa. He said he never saw Japanese. But in an airplane, those planes coming in so close, you could see the eyes of the German pilots, and they're right on you. And then you have to act with electric suddenness, because, let's give you a scenario here. They open up on you, and a German Focke-Wulf would have 6 guns, machine guns, heavy shells that large, and 2 rockets, sometimes 4 rockets, air-to-air rockets. So they were lethal. And they came in, as I said, very close. And let's say a rocket hits the plane, rocks it, and knock out an engine or two. And I'm going to give you an actual scene where the pilot was beheaded. Happened all the time. The most dangerous position on the plane was the pilot, not the navigator or the bombardier who was in the front, not even the ball terrace gunner underneath the plane. And I talked to this one kid who wasn't a medic. He was just a gunner in the back of the plane. There was a pilot, a co-pilot, an engineer up there, a radio operator. And in the back of the plane where the gunners, and of course way back, was the tail gunner. 9 yards. That's where you get the expression, the whole 9 yards. That's where the machine gun belt would extend from the middle of the plane back to the back of the plane. So I talked to one of these gunners. He said, what the hell was I going to do? The plane's shaking. There's no bathroom. Everybody has to shit their pants. Everybody has urine all over. They're vomiting. A lot of the guys are bleeding to death and screaming. Somebody yells, the pilot's lost his head. The co-pilot's commanding said someone come up and help him try to get this plane back, because some of these gunners had been trained as pilots and flunked out of pilot school. So they at least had the rudiments of flying. And he said that I was at the time, had my hand on a sucking wound of another gunner. And I knew if I pulled my hand off the sucking wound, he'd die. But I knew if I didn't get up front, the co-pilot might not be able to get the plane back to base, and we've lost everybody else on the plane. And it was a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. And he wound up in a mental hospital. And
Don, one thing you do so well in the book and also in Masters of the Air, the movie, is you show the progression of the psychological toll that these guys have as they're watching their planes go down. They're asking, you see any shoots? You see anybody getting out? I mean, and it's every mission that pressure just builds.
It did, because you went back and you had to relive the mission. Because if you see Masters there, they go back and they sit around with the base operations officer, and he asked them, what about, Squawk and Hawk? And that's a B-17. It went down. And in the plane, one of the guys asked pointedly, what about Rubbin' Eagle? Well, that exploded. You see any parachute? I told you it exploded. There's a lot of tension in the room on that. And then you were hustled off to your Nissan hut. But the Air Force, as soon as they got word that there were casualties in the plane, or that the plane had exploded, or that the crew had bailed out in German territory, they considered them dead. And they went into the Nissan huts and they stripped their beds, took all their belongings, pictures of mom, girlfriends, wives, rosaries, any sort of paraphernalia, any personal stuff, prophylactics, anything in there, that mom doesn't want to see when they send your flintlocker home.
That reminds me of the story of Levski, the guy that had two problems. So you want to tell that story about?
Yeah, Rulovsky. I met this guy. Most of my stories initially I got from. I started reading a book called Men on Fire. It's a textbook, a medical textbook by an Air Force combat surgeon. And it would be boring to most people, but it was transfixing to me because it was about one mission after another that wound up in tragedy, one after the other, these horrible tragedies. And then I started interviewing the airmen. And one of the first airmen I interviewed was Louis Lovsky, little tough guy, 5'5" from New Jersey. And I met him in Norfolk at a conference, a reunion, bomb. And Lou was shot down, happened all the time, on his first mission. He was in a B-24. And I said, and he said, I'm Jewish. And I should tell you this, but there was a knock on my hotel room. I was interviewing in my hotel room. And that's when I met Lou for the first time. I opened the door. He's a skinny little guy. And he said, I'm Lou Lovsky, and I can do 100 push-ups. What's this all about? He said, I'm in good shape. I don't want you to think I'm an old fart. And he hit the floor, did his 100. He said, now I'm ready to talk. And he described jumping out over Berlin as a Jew. And I said, I had a choice. I had a
dog tag.
On my dog tag, I had it said H for Hebrew. Okay, the Germans do that. A lot of guys filed it down. Okay, and in fear of being tortured or whatever, killed in Germany. And Lou said, I said, that must have been unbelievable, heading down to Berlin, Jewish kid, first mission. He said, that's not what scared me at all. I said, well, what scared you? He said, well, before I left on the mission, I told my buddies to take care of something. He said, I had bought, he used the term of the 40s, a gross of rubbers, okay, contraceptives, prophylactics. And I said, 144s. And I said,
Mom.
I said, were you that sexually active? He says, I was a virgin, but I was very hopeful. So that's how we started this. And he said, I stuffed them in the dress uniforms at my bed, by my bed back at the Nissan hut. And I knew the Air Force was going to strip all that stuff and send it home to Mom. And she's going to open it and think her son was a sex maniac. And that's what I worried about. And later on, he got the okay when he was sent to a prison camp. And guys from his unit were shot down and sent to the same camp. And as soon as they walked in, Lou was waiting at the gate. They said, we took care of it. We got that stuff out of there before it went home. Yeah.
Well, there was a certain, obviously, helpless feeling of the guys flying in the flak, and the Germans on the ground felt the same way, helpless.
Yeah, I mean,
commonality there, and part of the mission was, Harris was to defeat the production capacity by killing a lot of people, but the other part of the strategy, and I don't know what your comments about that would be, was to break the German will and morale.
Break the German morale.
Yeah. And did that succeed or not?
Well, that was the preeminent idea that the British had, that enough bombing, I mean, they had experienced the Blitz, enough bombing will create attritionally over time despair, hatred for the enemy, desire to get out of the war, and put pressure on the government. Anything, sign a peace treaty. We can't stand this. People have never experienced this. Every one of those bombs was like an atomic bomb would be to us today. I've never experienced anything quite like that. And the stories they heard. So I always compare, I always say, people talk about innocent people dying on the ground. Well, innocent people died in the air too. Those boys didn't want to be there. They wanted to be back like Andy Rudy at Syracuse in his sociology class. And, instead, he's flying over Leipzig, thinking he's going to die. But there's a very close similarity between flying into a flak field utterly helpless. You see, when we started to really attrit the German fighter force, I'll get to that in a second, we were flying mostly, the 8th Air Force, through flak. Now, there's a big difference, as one airman, Bert Stiles, described to a pilot. He said, I had good morale, crew morale. My guys were great, shouting out to one another, cooperating like a football team in the huddle. Germans had, banded at 12 o'clock high, banded at 6 o'clock high, banded at 4 o'clock. There's tremendous communication in the plane. Everyone had a throat mic, and they could communicate to each other. You couldn't call back to base. That was rare, but and the radio man did that. But you could talk to one another. And you had to be in touch with one another because lots of guys died of oxygen deprivation because in the fury of combat, as you're firing and things like that, sometimes your oxygen didn't get through to you because these guys got airsick all the time. And the vomit would be in the tubes, and at 52 degrees below zero, it freezes. So the air doesn't get through. In the fury of combat, you don't know that. And sometimes guns would jam, and we try to do a little scene of that, masters as well. Guy takes his silk gloves off and then his leather gloves, tries to clear the jam, and his hands stick to the metal, and he pulls off 3 layers of skin. So you got to be careful with all that sort of stuff. But I compare the conditions inside a cockpit. Don't forget, a cockpit is a claustrophobic space, and that scares people. So is a bomb shelter that a German woman is in with her 3 scared to death children between the ages of 8 and 2, packed together. Everyone's perspiring, screaming. The earth is rocky. Not a lot of oxygen is getting in there. All of a sudden, carbon monoxide starts to seep into it. People slowly start to fall asleep. The babies die first, then the 6-year-olds, then the 9-year-olds, then the older people die. Everyone did with the older people thought they were just... And if you stayed in the shelter for a while and weren't discovered, it got so hot that you were bait. And you were reduced in size by about a half to a fourth. And sometimes people would take the remains of their children and put them in suitcases and try to take them out of Hamburg to bury them somewhere else. I have a scene that's really harrowing here I wanted to describe. These 3 German women are on a plane leaving Hamburg. After Hamburg is hammered and the second freight raid and turned to soot and ash. This one woman was sitting all by herself, and 3 other Fräuleins were sitting across from her. And she didn't look that beat up. She didn't have fire scars or anything like that, or even a lot of dust. And the one woman says, well, at any rate, you managed to save something out of it. She saw the suitcase. You've been luckier than some of us, haven't you? And the young woman says, I saved the dearest thing in the world to me. Do you want to see it? She opened the suitcase. Inside was what looked like the blackened, shrunken body of a baby. The woman began to laugh hysterically. Of course, she's crazy at this point. That's my daughter. Isn't she sweet? She has such beautiful, fair curls and blue eyes, hasn't she? She's grown a lot in the last year. She's just 12 years old. But now she's shriveled, and I can carry her in my suitcase. Lots of scenes like that. That's not an exceptional scene. So that's terror. And the same kind of condition exists inside the plane, because when you're flying through flak, you can't kill the enemy. You can't even shoot. The enemy is unseen. It's this flak that's flying all over the place. And when the flak shells burst, even when they missed the planes, shards of flak would fill the sky. And it looked like a solid carpet of flak, 10 miles long. And you had to fly through it. And you could not take evasive action. If the flak was as close to the bombardier as Nick is to me, he had to fly right into it. Because LeMay and some of the commanders, Curtis LeMay, insisted that you have a flat platform, steady platform from which to bomb. Otherwise, LeMay tried to convince the crews that if they didn't bomb accurately, they'd have to go back to the target again and again and again. Whereas maybe if they flew into the flak, they'll take some casualty, but you don't have to go back to Saint Nazaire to bomb the Subpen again. So you have a condition of complete helplessness. And that's how bomber crewmen, when they broke down differently than combat. Look, my first books were all about infantry. And infantry broke down different from combat men. An infantryman might be firing, be a shell loader in Italy, loading a gigantic gun and just go crazy and run out in front of the gun and start picking flowers and running in circles, hysterical. And then they tackle him and pull him back. And the Air Force claimed that a guy was worth about what an Army truck was. An Army truck could get 48,000 miles out of. You could get about 38 to 48 missions out of a guy, and then they become a rag man, or they're not very effective anymore. So you pull them into an aid station, you shoot them up with sodium pentothal or sodium amythol, knocks them out, but they're still cognizant. They can hear you, they can speak, but slowly. Everything's slowed down. Put them on the floor, and believe it or not, using heavy Freudian psychology, try, as the theory was, to pull the trauma out from under them by having the kid relive it. And that just made it worse. They'd scream at him, 7 o'clock high, your buddy just lost set, 12 o'clock high, fuck a wolf, coming in. Harry's flying, if Harry's in the gunner's seat, he just had his arm blown off. The guy starts screaming and thinking, that's how you cure guys. Well, the cure rate wasn't very high. So crew morale really broke down at the end of the war when we started a really heavily bombed Germany. 170,000 tons of bombs dropped on Germany in the last 7 months of the war. And 102 of them were by the Americans. So we really started to hammer Germany and fly these flak missions. So there's a similarity between the two victims.
Let me bring you back a second here, maybe longer than a second for your answer, but the two goals, you talked about one of them already, and that is the bombing campaign designed to break the will of the German people. But there never was any resistance. But by 44, 45, at winter 44, 45, I mean, we pretty well killed off the flak artillery. We were, and pretty much wiped out the Luftwaffe that winter. The Wehrmacht was on its heels with the Soviets. So, but there wasn't any really resistance. So, ask you the first question is, did we ever really succeed?
Well, they had resistance.
Well, wait. The second question, I want you to come back because they're connected. The second was destroy the Luftwaffe and clear the skies for D-Day, and we're about the D-Day landings. And Eisenhower said, if there are any planes in the air on D-Day, they're going to be American or Allied airplanes. So those are the two goals. So did we succeed in either one of them?
Well, certainly we succeeded. The first great success of the war was made possible by the P-51 Mustang.
Right.
And the 8th Air Force gets to England in heavy force. They've been there a year already in the late spring of 43. And that's when it's decided to go ahead with the invasion, scheduled for May of 44. And we pushed it back a month. And so they're on the clock. There's a lot of pressure on these guys to fly. Hence the drug, addictions and stuff like that. But we weren't able to get at the heavy industries we were supposed to be bombing because our fighter escorts were largely Spitfires, and they only had a range to roughly Hanover, Germany, right on the border.
Up until P-51.
Yeah, up until the P-51s got there. So we're trying to balls it out, really, and fly. There are a lot of generals who believe we shouldn't fly at all, and until we got the P-51. But the problem was, I think I explained earlier to some groups in the trip, that we thought that the Mustang was a technological impossibility, that you could develop a plane that had legs that could fly all the way to Berlin, which means you really had to have large fuel tanks and extra tanks on the wings called Tokyo tanks. and combine that with nimbleness to be able to handle the German fast fighters, especially the Focke-Wulfs, and later the jets, with not ease, but with skill. And for that, you need to have a light, quick plane. But the Mustang miraculously combined both elements. So with the Mustang, and it got there just in time. I mean, it got there around Christmas of 44, when Jimmy Doolittle takes over the 8th Air Force. And he tells his flyers, look, none of this, fighter pilots, none of this hugging the planes, and protecting them like that, like a blanket. Go out and hunt the Germans, because we are involved in a pilot killing contest. The Germans are producing planes at underground factories, but they can't produce enough pilots with enough training to be able to handle you guys. You guys have 190 hours flight training. Some of those kids have 18. One German pilot told me, when I pulled my canopy shut, I thought I was pulling the lid down on my coffin, trying to mess with these Americans. So the idea was, and the bomber boys learned this later, how do you get the Luftwaffe up? You fly over prestige targets like Berlin. Hitler has to defend Berlin. He's under a lot of heat already. His regime's starting to crack because he couldn't support his own people. He couldn't protect his own people. And so he's got to bring in lots of planes from the Russian front to defend the Western front. So you draw the planes up and with these fleets of bombers, and when they get to a certain height, the Mustangs slaughter them. So the bombers, as the bomber pilots described it, were bait. That's what they're doing. And they're flying dedicated missions. Spaatz kept telling them, Carl Spaatz, is head of the 8th Air Force. I grew up next to Spaatz Airfield in Reading, Pennsylvania. And he set the same, usually they'd bomb a target over here and then a target next day 300 miles away, a target 1,200 miles away. On the Wednesday, Thursday, another target over here. He sends the guys back to the same target day after day after day. That's how he finally beat the Germans. Repeated strike. Germany was killed by 1,000 blows, not by one big bomb. But now the Germans know they're coming. And these fights were something terrific. The 8th Air Force lost 19,000, the Allied Air Forces lost 19,000 pilots in these fights. We lost under 10,000 guys on the beaches of Normandy. When I was standing at my uncle's site where he landed, where they had built a beautiful obelisk a number of years ago, I thought to myself, this is wonderful. But I wish they had built a monument to the 19,000 airmen who were sacrificed to make the landing possible. And we can maybe talk about this at the Q&A, but we're now building that monument on the Utah beach, and we'll dedicate it next year. I've just raised the last $500,000 3 days ago. So that's going to happen.
We'll come back to D-Day.
For airmen.
Yeah.
And so, by the time D-Day occurs, by the time the landing fleet gets there, the Air Force isn't quite sure that the Luftwaffe isn't going to be there. They thought they had killed the Luftwaffe, Western Command. And like Eisenhower said, if you see planes, they'll be ours. But he wasn't quite sure. It took a little hubris to say that, because the Germans could have been doing what they did throughout the war, hiding planes in forest factories or hiding them deeper into Germany and fueling them on the way at German cities like Munster and places like that. So they flew down to, the Air Force flew some of its commanders down to the Normandy beaches on D-Day and in a B-17, and they just waited there to see if the Luftwaffe would show up. And that's when they knew they weren't going to show up, at the very, very end.
Oh, was that lucky? I mean, there were a couple of squadrons, 390.
They got enough
They
planes
could have gotten in there, but they didn't. So, I mean, was that German ineptitude or?
No, they were
just
overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Yeah. They had about 40 planes stuck in bases all over the place. See, the Americans had been heavily bombing those bases close to the coast as part of the preparations for D-Day. We all hear about Operation Choo Choo hitting the trains, destroying, the munitions, trying to cut their supply lines. But we also destroyed the airfields by making gigantic holes in the airfields, pockmarking the airfields.
But they missed the area that they were shot, the bombers. So how much did the air superiority matter on D-Day? Certainly Luftwaffe wasn't there.
Well, on the actual day of the invasion, the Air Force was disappointed because Rosie Rosenthal was the hero of my book, 52 missions and whatever. We talk about him sometime. He said, it happened so quickly. Here are the kids coming out of the Higgins boats and hitting the beaches. And the beaches were much closer to the cliffs where the German main guns were than we expected. Because my uncle's unit, the 1st Division, expected, their big surprise was there were no foxholes on the beach created by the bomb craters that they could jump into. They thought they knew the German major weapon on the beach was the machine gun, and the nests were close to the beaches. But they thought with the fire ships that they had, that could get in real close and blast these positions out. Yogi Berra, the Yankee catcher, was in one for 18 hours on D-Day. And they thought they'd obliterated those sites until they landed. And the Germans had been not on Normandy, but in Normandy, in caverns, caves, bunkers, which we'll see on D-Day. But it was right. So the guys, they were proud of the missions. It was different on Utah. When you go to Utah, the landing was easier for a number of reasons. There wasn't as much German power concentrated there. The 82nd Airborne, 101st had cut off approaches to the beaches, and the area was heavily flooded by the farmers. So there are all sorts of obstacles like that. But one of the things was that on Omaha, the fleet came in. If that's Omaha Beach down there, and I'm flying in from the north to south, I fly over the invasion fleet, and at exactly the right moment, drop. Well, Rosenthal had been at St. Lo when we killed lots of American airmen in a effort later on, to open up the bocage. But even before that, he knew how inaccurate pinpoint bombing was. And so they waited just an extra half second. And in that half second, they're over the cliffs. So they dropped behind the beaches, and they killed a lot of Frenchmen. And, of course, to clear the bocage, because landing means nothing, you have the build-up and then the breakout. And the breakout took 6 weeks. It was one of those murderous fights of World War II. And the Germans hold up using French civilians literally, as, target practice for our air forces. In order to take these towns like St. Lo, you go in St. Lo, see the pictures in St. Lo after the war. There isn't St. Lo. It's a chapel and houses and things like that. So we wind up killing 60,000 Frenchmen.
But you didn't finish talking about Utah. There was a difference in the bombing.
Oh, yeah. In Utah, they flew there, the podium, to there. They flew across like this. So they were able to, and the German emplacements are close to the shoreline. And so they were able to knock out the German emplacements like that, flying like that. And it couldn't actually be done on Omaha because Omaha has a kind of banana shape. So if you get in there like that, you're into insulating fire from the right, the left, and the front. So it was considered too dangerous to fly in like that. The Air Force never liked to fly over formations of troops. They preferred this kind of bombing.
Yeah, and I think also on the Omaha, they couldn't come across this way because they had been coming across the same flight path of the B-26s that were going down Utah. So it was kind of a right angle.
Yeah,
and they didn't want to have our own planes running into each other.
Well, they used different planes, as you said very, very wisely. They used B-26s, two-engine planes, which were more maneuverable, had lower ceiling, that would get in real tight, almost like a fighter. I mean, every 8th Air Force airman prayed in his dream of dreams that he'd be flying a fighter plane like we have today. We have fighter bombers. They don't have. Even in Vietnam, we use, large planes that could fly at altitudes of 70 and 80,000 feet to hit Hanoi and places like that. But it's fighter bombers that do most of the damage. We don't have a plane like that. Yeah, that's going to be that effective. Yeah. Now, you said in the second half of the thing, when D-Day is over, and the concomitant of D-Day is, of course, that the German Air Force is significantly weakened. So it's easier to fly missions after primo targets. And the Air Force, finally, they had these target committees. And in the beginning, there's a lot of mistakes made. They're hitting ball-bearing factories when actually the Germans were buying ball bearings. They had enough of them. They bought them from the Swedes, who were supposedly neutral. They bought material from the Swiss. But that phase of the war, toward the end, we're going to go after transportation, coal especially, create a coal famine, and oil. We ran our first 2 oil raids. Spots convinced Eisenhower. Eisenhower said in February, nobody flies a bombing mission unless it has to do with D-Day. Every plane in the 8th Air Force is grounded. Every mission has some spots convinced him to hit oil. And the oil attacks were terrifically successful. Before, the only oil raids we ran were in Ploesti, Romania. If that's our hands now, the Russians had taken that. Not already, the Russians had taken it over. But after D-Day, we now have the force structure. See, the problem, is when people analyze the failure and success of the air war, it's a stupid question because there's 9 or 10 air wars. The air war in the beginning is nothing. I mean, a dozen planes flying to Rouen, and one gets hit by a pigeon. And, this is the air war. The Germans didn't even take it seriously. It's the Brits they were worried about for a long time. But later on, with 170,000 tons of bombs, you're hitting everything. And that, of course, will lead eventually to overbombing, like Dresden, where you got the technology. This is where technology starts to drive things. You got it, use it. Although, I talked to a guy, Johnny Morrow, who was a gunner. I said, Johnny, why'd you bomb Dresden so close to the end of the war? He said, how the fuck did I know it was the end of the war? I said, that's a good point. And anyway, that's when a lot of the overkill starts to occur. Hamburg-like bombing ad nauseum. And Harris kept hitting the wrong places. So insistent was he in wiping out cities. He hit one small, and the Americans kept telling him, I have the most valuable sources I have are the Joint Commanders' reports of their meetings. Doolittle especially, is hammering Harris. You've got to come in and help. We finally found the 2 Achilles heels of the German system. It's transportation system and it's oil. Transportation because there was a guy named Solly Zuckerman who was a British intellectual, an anthropologist actually, who figured this plan out. He said, why are we hitting pit heads of coal and then an iron factory and then a factory that manufactures one part of the plane, the wing, the other part, the fuselage, the other part, the wheels, and things like that? Why not wait till it's all done? And the trains will come to these gigantic marshal yards, usually in Belgium and France. And because the French had a really good Belgian rail system. And I live next to a marshal yard in Reading, Pennsylvania. You might know it's on the Monopoly board. And you could hear the clanging of the rail trains and things like that. And if I have a load of manganese and iron and zinc I'll take all the zinc, all the manganese, and all the iron and take it over to a special train that delivers just manganese, just this, just that. So they're coupling in there, and they're a fat target. So we're just going to bomb these marshalling yards. And here's the great moral conundrum of the war. We start to bomb these places, and with tremendous success, okay, we're wiping out the German economy, and especially the coal trains. We're a petrol power. The United States is a petrol colossus. It controls 91% of the world's oil. Germany is a coal economy, okay? So we go after coal, and that's what Germany, gas, of course, and oil to move machinery, but coal to run factories. And these raids, as I said, were devastatingly successful. Problem, along with oil. So it'd be one day oil or the same day oil, and the marshalling yards are alternating targets. And we're hitting them repeatedly. We couldn't do that before. Albert Speer says in his memoirs, he makes a lot of stupid statements in there. One of the stupidest is he says that the Americans, he ridicules the Americans constantly, and like a lot of British historians do. And sorry, Keith, if you're in the audience. Where was I, Nick?
You're talking about Albert Speer.
Yeah, Speer says, Speer says, when we hit Regensburg and Schweinfurt in August 18th, 1943, hit them hard, and with a dual raid, he said, that shook us up. And the same thing happened after Hamburg. He told the Fuhrer after Hamburg, 5 or 6 more Hamburgs, and we're kaput as a nation. We have to all fold it up. He told the Fuhrer that. And but we couldn't fly 5 or 6 missions. We didn't have the crews, and we didn't have the planes. We were losing sometimes 57 to 60 planes. That's 620 guys a mission. So it takes long periods of time to regroup. Now, a lot of Air Force historians make one of the capital mistakes of the Air War historiography and said that they hit the Americans so hard they stopped flying. The problem is they didn't stop flying. They continued to fly through cloud cover, through hail, through sleet, through opposition, and continued to take staggering casualties right into December. A lot of those raids that we were supposed to fly in December, people attribute to a command decision. It was actually a decision made by Mother Nature, the weather. But when we have the force structure, when we can put up, like in one of the biggest raids in Berlin with 1,600 bombers. Now, if you have a 1,600 bomber train, your tail is in London, okay? And the front bombardier is over where we are today in Amsterdam. That's how long the bomber train is. And it's escorted by 1,600 fighter planes. I talked to a woman in Saxony. I said, when did you think the war was over? She said, well, I didn't believe a lot of the propaganda leaflets, but that the Nazis were passing around. But I did know that your Air Force passed over my village, and it took an hour and a half for them to fly over. None of them were painted. None of them were camouflaged. They weren't brown. They were silver. And she said in German, here come the silvers. It's all silvers now, coming out of the factories of Detroit. Then she knew it was over.
All right, with that, why don't we open it up to the audience? I think Jeremy's got a microphone back there, I think.
Yeah, if you could please raise your hand. We'll get a couple questions in before we wrap up for the evening. Gentlemen, we're going to go towards the front to your left, please.
I always had a question about the bomb loads that the B-17s were carrying. It seems like most of them were 500-pound bombs,
Yes.
while the Brits were carrying much heavier bombs, not heavier bomb loads, obviously as some bigger airplanes, but they were carrying 1,000, 5,000, sometimes 10,000-pound bombs. I was kind of curious as to why we were carrying only 500-pounders, not some larger bombs.
I'd like to know that too. and the Air Force was criticized for that, the lightness of their bombs. When we brought Harris in eventually, and he did fly against places like Peenemünde, and the British learned to fly as accurately at night as we flew in the daytime, but with more effect actually, because they used those ball boys, which were 5,000 pounds, and they used the blockbusters, thunderclaps they sometimes call them, which are 9,000 pounds. Paul Tibbets dropped an atomic bomb that weighed 8,000 pounds. And so that bombing became, when it was accurate, became more effective. If you went out to the bunker down, you take that trip to that gigantic German bunker down in Essen. Each of the planes, British planes that hit that, only carried one bomb, a 9,000-pound bomb. Two of them hit in the corner and blew a hole in the roof, but that was as far as they got. Yeah, we should have, but you make these decisions ahead of time, just like the decision to have only a certain number of divisions. We were running out of guys at the end of the war. Yeah, I had to lower the draft age and things like that. And that laid open opportunities for Puerto Rican kids and African American kids to serve, which they wanted to do desperately. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Good question.
Gentleman towards the center to your right.
Don, could you tell us a little bit more about your dad's flying experience?
Oh, he didn't have much flying experience. He was trained as an air gunner, but he was moved preeminently for most of the war, to control tower operations and mapping out a new route that the Air Force would take. So he made it over to the theaters. The Air Force used to fly the circle route, where they'd take their planes to England. They had women pilots largely bring the bombers, and they pressed for combat heavily because the Russians, Air Force, almost a quarter of the Russian Air Force were women. And but they take the planes to demarcation points like Prestwick, Maine, and fly over Newfoundland, Iceland, and across. And so we had to get planes in faster, and especially when we invaded North Africa. So they had a southern route that took you down through Brazil. So he helped to map that out, to go over that front and set up a whole Air Force infrastructure in Benghazi and places like that. Yeah, so that was primarily his combat duty. Yeah.
Gentleman to your right, about halfway back in the orange shirt with Mike, please.
I'm retired Air Force, and I was just wondering, with hindsight that you've seen all of your study, how would you have differed from the strategy they did for daylight bombing? I know the P-51 was a big game changer, but before that, how would
I had a little problem here.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, so the daylight bombing was not a great strategy at all until the P-51 came. With hindsight now, how would you have done it differently for bombing Germany in the early part of the war?
Well, that's just it. I don't know. And then I would ask myself that question all the time. There were two generals who were involved in strategizing the air war. And during the war, when this was seen to be flying these unescorted missions against submarine pens, you see, bombing submarine pens is just like bombing that German bunker. They had 5.5-foot reinforced concrete. We went down and visited those, remember, on a trip, and they were incredible. They still stand. They can't even kill them. And, but why are they flying when the Germans are inside? Through an elevator system, they could take their submarines below the surface. We destroyed a lot of the infrastructure around the bases. So guys are flying missions that aren't effective, that can't hit the target, and they're dying in unacceptable numbers. This is the theme of 12 o'clock high. And this is why 12 o'clock high is used so extensively in corporate boardrooms by executives. How can you get employees to take on inordinately difficult tasks and where you don't get results at first and stay with it. But these two commanders both concluded that they wouldn't have flown early on. But when I look at it and see the other reports and counter reports, you had to fly. You had the plane. You had to do what was possible. Because this lifeline that they were hitting, the Mid-Atlantic lifeline, that they extended from, Manchester and other places, all the way across to Norfolk and places like that. We built during the war 2 gigantic pipelines like that. We can't do that today. And if you cut that lifeline, England is stuck. England got 90% of its oil from the United States, all its fruit, all its vegetables. And where do you put the planes if England falls? That would have been the biggest tragedy of all if England fell. As I explained in an earlier lecture, we had originally planned to fly all the planes out of France. But Hitler wraps up France in June of 1945. But, what do you do? I don't know. I think I would have did what LeMay tried to do, and that was do the best she could to protect the crews and to make the bombing effective, knowing that it's like the myth of Sisyphus. You're never going to get to the top. You're never going to achieve your objective. The effort was in, the glory is in the effort. But you create diversions. They have to divert. The British loved it because it diverted fighters from their nighttime, their nighttime raids on German cities. It's just like the joke in the British Air Force. They loved it when the low-flying Sterlings were put at the bottom of the formation because they flew so low. The crews thought, oh, they'll get knocked out before us, before the big Lancasters. It was a sick joke, but yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nick Mueller and Dr. Donald Miller, thank you.